The air in the lab was thick with anticipation. Alexis Carron could barely contain her excitement as she stood before the culmination of her life's work, the quantum gateway. It had taken years of research, late nights, and sacrifices she didn't even want to think about anymore, but it was here. The quantum device hummed on the platform before her, a masterpiece of theoretical physics and bleeding-edge technology. Alexis adjusted her glasses, her eyes sharp and focused, as she reviewed the data on the screen for the final time. Everything was in place. Her team had left for the night, and she was alone in the underground lab, exactly how she wanted it. This moment wasn't something to be shared. It was hers, her success, her breakthrough. If it worked, the name Alexis Carron would be etched into the annals of history. The device sat at the center of the room, connected to towering machines that monitored every particle, every shift in energy. It was sleek, polished metal with rings of glowing energy coiling within its center, like the orbit of a miniature galaxy. The gateway wasn't just an experiment. It was a revolution, one that would change the understanding of reality itself. She stood on the cusp of proving that parallel dimensions existed. The possibility had obsessed her since her university days, the thought that there could be other worlds, countless variations of their own universe, each slightly altered from the next. Some physicists had scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as science fiction. But not Alexis. She had devoted her life to cracking the code that could unlock the door to these other realities. Tonight, the door would open. Alexis wiped a bead of sweat from her brow and set the final sequence into motion. Her fingers danced across the touchpad, entering the commands with precision, and the quantum device responded with a low hum. Lights flickered along the walls as power surged through the room, and the display panels around her came alive, reading streams of data in real time. The air shifted. She felt a strange pull in the atmosphere, a sensation that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The gateway's inner core began to glow, the light growing brighter, expanding into the space in front of her. It was happening. Her breath caught in her throat as a shimmering veil of light formed in the center of the room. The portal was unlike anything she had imagined. It wasn't a black hole, nor a swirling vortex of chaos. Instead, it looked like a sheet of liquid glass, rippling softly as though moved by an invisible wind. The surface reflected the lab around her, but there was something off. Alexis leaned in closer, her heartbeat quickening. She could see her own reflection staring back at her, the lab's sterile white walls behind her. But the reflection was subtly different. The colors seemed muted, the light dimmer. She squinted, trying to make sense of it. Beyond the surface of the portal, she could see the outline of another world, her world. But it wasn't quite right. It was like looking through a distorted lens, a mirror that warped reality ever so slightly. It's real, she thought, her pulse racing. It's real? She took a cautious step toward the gateway, her hand trembling as she reached out. Her fingertips hovered just inches from the surface. The air was electric, crackling with energy. She could feel something pulling at her, urging her forward. This is it. This is the proof. The light shifted, and for a brief moment, Alexis thought she saw something in the depths of the portal. A shadow, a figure. She blinked and it was gone, replaced by the familiar outline of the lab's reflection. Her heart was pounding now, a mix of exhilaration and unease swirling in her chest. She glanced down at the readings on the display. Everything was functioning within expected parameters. Every calculation had been correct. The gateway was stable. But something gnawed at her, something in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite place. Her instincts told her to stop, to turn off the machine and analyze what she had seen. But she had come too far to back down now. This was history in the making, and she wasn't about to let fear stop her. She reached out once more, this time pressing her hand fully against the surface of the portal. The moment her skin touched it, she felt a jolt, like static electricity, but stronger, more visceral. Her vision blurred for a second, and the air around her seemed to ripple. She stumbled back, pulling her hand away, her breath catching in her throat. The portal flickered, and for a moment she thought she heard something. A whisper, faint and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. She shook her head, clearing the sensation. It had to be her imagination. The stress was getting to her. As the light from the portal dimmed slightly, Alexis steadied herself. She would need to document this, run more tests, analyze the dimensional feedback. There was still so much to do, so many questions to answer. But for now, the portal stood open, a silent window into a world that was both hers and not hers. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at the shimmering surface of the gateway. The sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Years of research, countless sleepless nights, it had all led to this. Yet, in the back of her mind, that unease remained. Something felt wrong, something she couldn't quite define, but she pushed it aside. The experiment was a success. The portal worked. Everything else could wait. She didn't notice the faint movement in the reflection behind her, the subtle shift in the shadows on the other side of the gateway. The universe had just opened its door, and something, somewhere, was looking back. Alexis sat in her office, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee. Her eyes were glued to the data streaming across her monitor, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting back to that moment in the lab 2 days ago when she'd first opened the portal. The memory replayed in her head like a looping film reel, every second of it vivid. The shimmering light, the strange, almost sentient energy that filled the room, and the way her skin had tingled when she touched the surface of the gateway. But it was that whisper, the faint, barely audible sound that still haunted her thoughts. Had it really happened? Or was it just a figment of her imagination, brought on by exhaustion? She shook her head and pushed the thoughts aside. The gateway had been a success, an undeniable, monumental success. The media buzzed with rumors about the project, though they knew little of the specifics. She had spent the past 2 days buried in her lab, combing through the readings, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything. The data was mostly as expected, but there were traces of something she couldn't quite explain. A subtle distortion in the energy readings, a ripple in the fabric of space-time that didn't match her models. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It's nothing, she reassured herself for the 100th time. Just an artifact of the energy field, something the equipment couldn't fully process. But that gnawing feeling of unease remained. Her gaze drifted over the disarray of her desk. Papers were strewn everywhere, notes on quantum mechanics, formulas scribbled in the margins, half-empty coffee mugs stacked precariously in one corner. She hadn't had the energy to clean up. Not lately. Things were starting to blur, her mind feeling heavier each day. The small clock on her wall ticked quietly, the sound oddly soothing. Yet it was late, past midnight, and her apartment back home felt more and more distant. It had been her sanctuary after long days of work, but now it seemed like just another place where things were slowly going wrong. It started with her keys. The day after the experiment, Alexis had come home exhausted, tossing her keys on the kitchen counter like she always did. The next morning, they were gone. Not just misplaced, but entirely missing. She searched the whole apartment, growing more frustrated and sleep-deprived. Finally, she found them sitting in her living room on the coffee table, a place she was certain she hadn't even been in the previous night. She brushed it off as exhaustion. A minor slip-up, she thought. Nothing more. But it wasn't the only thing. In the days that followed, small, unsettling changes began to happen. Her toothbrush would be in a different holder. Her phone charger was moved to the opposite side of the room. At first, it was so minor she didn't pay much attention. But the more it happened, the more it gnawed at her, like an itch at the back of her mind. And then came the voices. The first time it happened, she was lying in bed, trying to calm her racing mind and shut out the whirlwind of scientific theories spinning in her head. Her bedroom was silent, the hum of the city outside a distant murmur. Then she heard it, faint at first, like a breeze carrying distant words. She opened her eyes, staring up at the ceiling, and listened. It was there, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A whisper, not quite a voice, but more like a presence, a sound just beyond her reach. She strained to catch the words, but they slipped away, their meaning just out of grasp. They seemed to be speaking in a language she didn't understand, an ancient, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, but the whisper was gone. Alexis tried to dismiss it as a dream. Stress-induced, perhaps. After all, the mind could play tricks when it was overworked, right? But the next night it happened again, and the night after that. The voices grew louder, the whispers clearer. She could almost make out the words now, though they still felt foreign to her, as if spoken from some other place, another plane of existence. The unsettling part wasn't just the sound. It was the fact that one of the voices sounded like her own. She told herself it was her imagination. But each time she woke from those half-dreams, her skin prickled with the sensation that she wasn't alone. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was on the fourth day, as she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, that things began to truly unravel. The morning light streamed through the window, casting pale rays over the sink as she brushed her teeth, her reflection staring back at her as it always did. She was tired, more so than she'd been in years. Her reflection looked gaunt, her eyes hollowed out from sleepless nights spent analyzing data and ignoring the creeping fear in the back of her mind. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to snap herself out of it. Leaning in closer to the mirror, she examined herself, noting how pale she had become. Stress, she thought again, as if repeating it would make it true. Just stress. But then something strange happened. Her reflection didn't move. At first, it was so subtle that she almost didn't notice. She turned her head to the side, reaching for the towel beside the sink. But her reflection, her own reflection, lagged behind. It stayed staring forward for just a split second too long, as if it hadn't quite caught up with her. Alexis froze, towel halfway to her face, her breath shallow. Slowly, she looked back at the mirror. The reflection moved with her this time, perfectly synchronized, but the damage was done. Her pulse raced as she stood there, staring into her own eyes, questioning everything she knew to be real. Was it her imagination? A trick of the light? She turned her head again, quicker this time, testing the mirror. It followed perfectly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside the mirror was watching her, something other than her reflection. And then she saw it. Her reflection smiled. Not a subtle half-smile like hers, but a slow, deliberate grin that sent a wave of nausea crashing through her. Alexis stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest, but the reflection's smile faded as though it had never been there. She stumbled out of the bathroom, breathing heavily, her mind spinning. She couldn't explain what had just happened. She didn't want to. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Something far beyond exhaustion, far beyond stress. She could feel it now, an invisible presence lurking at the edges of her life, watching her, waiting. The whispers were louder that night, louder and more insistent. She no longer heard just faint echoes, but distinct voices. Different versions of herself calling out to her from somewhere she couldn't see. The other versions of Alexis had come through. They had found her, and they weren't going away. Alexis sat on her living room couch, staring blankly at the flickering television screen. The sound was muted, and she wasn't watching the show. It was just background noise to drown out the suffocating silence that had swallowed her life. Her apartment felt foreign, as though she had woken up in someone else's space, though she knew it was hers. Every corner of the room, every piece of furniture was exactly as it had always been. Yet it all felt wrong. The whispers had become constant now, following her every move. They were no longer confined to the edges of sleep. Now they hummed in the back of her mind while she worked, while she ate, while she walked the quiet halls of the research facility. Voices that spoke in her tone, but different, distant. Versions of herself, she knew, calling to her from other realities, other dimensions she had unwittingly connected to. Each voice was layered on top of the next, a dissonant chorus that made it impossible for her to think straight. But the worst part wasn't the whispers. It was the feeling of being watched. At first, she had convinced herself that it was paranoia, just a side effect of the experiment. After all, opening a portal to a parallel dimension was bound to come with some psychological repercussions. But this was different. It wasn't in her head. Something else was there, something real. The first time she saw it, she had nearly screamed. It had been late at night after another long day in the lab. She had come home exhausted but too wired to sleep, so she had made tea and sat by the window to unwind. The city lights twinkled in the distance, the streets below quiet. Alexis found herself zoning out, staring at the skyline, letting her mind drift. That's when she saw it, a figure in the reflection of the window. Her breath caught in her throat. At first, she thought it was just her own reflection, a trick of the light. But as she focused, the figure became clearer. It was her face, her body standing beside her. But something was wrong. Her reflection's expression didn't match her own. Alexis was frowning, exhausted, her lips pursed in thought. The reflection, however, wore a wide, eerie grin. For a long moment, she couldn't move, her body paralyzed with a cold, sinking fear. The reflection should not have been smiling. Alexis turned her head slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, expecting to see someone standing beside her. But when she looked, there was no one there, just the empty space of her living room, her own shadow stretching across the floor. She turned back to the window, hoping it was just her imagination, but the reflection was gone. Only her own wide-eyed face stared back at her now. She had backed away from the window, trembling, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. But deep down, she knew what it was. She knew the truth. Another version of her had come through. The next few days were a blur. Time seemed to warp around her, slipping through her fingers like sand. Hours would disappear, entire conversations erased from her memory as though they had never happened. Alexis would find herself in places she didn't remember walking to. The lab, the hallway, even the stairwell of her apartment building. One evening, she found herself standing on the roof of her building, staring down at the city below. The cold wind whipped through her hair, biting at her skin, but she couldn't remember how she had gotten there. The last thing she recalled was sitting at her desk, reviewing the latest data from the quantum experiment, and then nothing. A blank spot in her memory. The next thing she knew, she was standing on the edge of the rooftop, her toes dangerously close to the ledge. She took a step back, panic rising in her throat. Her hands shook as she wrapped her coat tighter around herself, trying to make sense of it. But there was no sense to be made. Something was happening to her. She was losing time, losing control. The voices in her head weren't just voices anymore. They were starting to take over. It happened again later that night. Alexis was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the soft glow of the moon filtering through the blinds. Her eyes were heavy, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, the whispers grew louder, voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. She couldn't escape them. They were always there, lurking just beneath her consciousness, calling to her from the other side. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it again. That faint sound, like someone shifting beside her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head toward the mirror on the wall. What she saw made her blood run cold. Her reflection was standing beside the bed. But this time, it wasn't just a trick of the light or a delayed image. It was real. She was standing there, her doppelganger, watching her with those same hollow eyes and that twisted, unnatural smile. Alexis's stomach churned with fear. The other Alexis stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes locked on Alexis's face. Alexis wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but she was frozen in place, trapped by some invisible force. The reflection leaned down, bending at the waist, until its face was level with hers. Alexis could feel the cold, unnatural presence of the thing beside her, as if it were breathing the same air. Its smile grew wider, more grotesque. "Who are you?" Alexis whispered, her voice barely audible, her lips trembling. The doppelganger tilted its head, still smiling. It didn't speak, but its eyes told her everything. It wasn't just a reflection. It was her. A version of her that had crossed over, that had slipped through the cracks between dimensions. And it wanted something. Alexis felt the pressure in her mind, a growing weight that pressed against her consciousness. She could feel it now. The other Alexis was pushing in, trying to take control, trying to push the real Alexis back. She fought it, her mind racing with panic, but the force was overwhelming. The other version of herself was stronger. For a brief, terrifying moment, Alexis felt her mind slip, as though she were being pulled underwater. The world around her became blurry, and she struggled to stay conscious, to hold on to herself. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the other Alexis retreated. The pressure lifted and the doppelganger was gone. Alexis sat up in bed, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Her body was drenched in sweat, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She glanced at the mirror. It was empty now, just her own reflection staring back at her, wide-eyed and terrified. But she knew the truth. The other Alexis wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment to strike. And next time it wouldn't stop. Next time it would take everything. Over the next few days, Alexis felt her grip on reality begin to slip. The other versions of herself weren't just whispering in her mind anymore, they were acting. She would black out for minutes, sometimes hours, and when she came to, things had moved. Conversations had happened. Decisions had been made. Decisions she hadn't made. One morning, she woke up to find her work documents open on her laptop, files she didn't remember reviewing. Colleagues approached her at the lab, referencing discussions she had no recollection of. They didn't seem to notice anything strange, but Alexis knew. The other Alexis had been there. The other versions of her were living in her place, slipping in and out of her mind like shadows. Her thoughts were no longer her own. Her life, her mind, her very identity was being eroded piece by piece. She was no longer sure which Alexis she was. The lines between them were blurring, merging into something she didn't understand, something she couldn't stop. The worst part, she wasn't sure she wanted to anymore. Alexis blinked awake, her vision blurred, head throbbing. The world around her felt distant, like she was viewing it through a fogged lens. She sat up slowly, her body heavy, disoriented. Her apartment, normally familiar and comforting, now seemed cold, alien. The walls felt too close, the air too still. The quiet was oppressive, pressing down on her as though the entire building was holding its breath. How long had she been out this time? She glanced at the clock on the wall, but it didn't make sense. It had been 10 a.m. just a few moments ago. Now the hands pointed to 3 p.m. 5 hours gone. 5 hours where she didn't exist. Her mind, once a fortress of sharp logic and control, now felt like shifting sand, crumbling beneath the weight of too many voices, too many versions of herself. They swarmed within her, each one clamoring for attention, pulling her in 1,000 different directions. Her thoughts were no longer hers. Who am I right now? She thought, and the question lingered unanswered. She stood shakily, her body moving as though it belonged to someone else, her limbs stiff, disconnected. Every movement felt wrong. She made her way to the bathroom, needing to see her reflection, needing to confirm that she still existed, that she was still here. But in her heart, she already knew the truth. The mirror greeted her with a face she no longer recognized. It was her face, of course, pale, gaunt, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But behind those eyes, she could feel them. The others, the versions of her that had bled through from the other dimensions. Some of them were angry, some were scared, and some were twisted. Dark things that barely resembled humanity. She touched her reflection, her fingertips cold against the glass. The image in the mirror lingered for a beat too long, as if reluctant to move with her. She stared into her own eyes, searching for herself, the real her. But all she saw were the shadows of others. The reflection twitched, a subtle but unmistakable sign of something else looking back at her. A soft knock echoed from her apartment door. Her breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't been expecting anyone, but the sound was calm, deliberate, as though whoever was there knew she would answer. Slowly, she made her way to the door, her feet dragging across the floor. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. As the door creaked open, her heart seized. Standing in the hallway was herself. Another Alexis. This version of her had eyes that were impossibly dark, like black voids that swallowed the light. Her skin was smooth, too smooth, as if the lines of age and stress had been erased. And she smiled, that terrible, knowing smile that Alexis had seen so many times in her reflections. "Hello, Alexis," the other Alexis said, her voice low and calm, a perfect mimicry of her own. "It's time." Alexis stumbled back, her mind reeling. The door slammed shut on its own, the force rattling the walls. She turned, panicked, but her apartment wasn't hers anymore. The room warped around her, twisting, stretching in ways that defied logic. The walls seemed to pulse, alive, as if they were breathing in sync with her terror. "No," Alexis whispered, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. Her hands pressed against her temples, trying to block out the voices that were growing louder, more insistent. "Let go," they whispered. "Let us in. We belong here now." The pressure in her mind was unbearable, a weight that crushed her thoughts, her will. She could feel them pushing against her consciousness, each version of herself vying for control. Some were familiar, some were monstrous, and all of them wanted the same thing, to take her place. One of them, the darkest one, was winning. Her vision blurred again, this time from tears. She wasn't strong enough to stop it. The voices were too many, too loud. She could feel herself slipping away, her identity unraveling like frayed string. The walls around her flickered between realities, showing glimpses of other worlds, places where she had made different choices, lived different lives. In some of them, she wasn't even human anymore. Alexis fell to her knees, her body trembling. The world around her was collapsing, folding in on itself as the other versions of her pressed in, relentless. "Please," she gasped, though she didn't know who she was begging. Her thoughts fractured, her memories splintered. She could no longer tell where she ended and the others began. They were all part of her now, or was she part of them? It didn't matter. The idea of a single, cohesive identity was crumbling into nothingness. She could feel the darkest one creeping in, taking over. It was a version of her born from the deepest recesses of the multiverse, a version that had long since shed any semblance of humanity. It was ancient, patient, and it had been waiting for this moment. Alexis tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body jerked violently, her limbs moving of their own accord. The darkness within her mind expanded, swallowing her whole, until she was nothing but a distant voice, a faint echo drowned out by the others. The thing that wore her face stood slowly, its movements deliberate, calculating. It tilted its head, flexing its fingers as though testing out a new form. A cruel smile spread across its lips as it gazed into the mirror. The last remaining sliver of Alexis, the real Alexis, was trapped inside her own mind, watching helplessly from the farthest corners of her consciousness. She could see what the thing was seeing, feel what it was feeling, but she was no longer in control. She was nothing more than a whisper now, lost in the cacophony of the other voices. The thing stared at its reflection for a long moment, admiring its new form. Then, with a satisfied sigh, it turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving behind the remnants of Alexis Carron. The door closed softly behind it, and the apartment fell into silence. Alexis was gone. And in her place, something else had emerged, a being stitched together from the fractured minds of 1,000 different versions of her, a creature no longer bound by human limitations or morality. It walked into the night, unburdened by the weight of its many selves, its smile wide and cold. The real Alexis was just one of many voices now, drifting aimlessly in the void of a mind that no longer belonged to her. The thing that wore her skin was free,